Thank you, Amy, and welcome everyone to today's HR Insight. My name is Lori Dahlberg, and I am the HR Consulting Manager here at Eide Bailey. My job is to work with clients on anything HR related. So that can be anything from recruitment all the way through to termination, and includes policies, compensation studies, job descriptions, all the fun stuff. And I'm really excited today to be talking about something other than COVID-19. So I am looking forward to speaking with you about the importance of personnel file audits and HR organizational audits. So we are just going to kick it right off. And here we go. So why is there a need for a personnel file audit? Well, there's a lot of information that you can take when you do a personnel file audit that will give you a lot of insight with regards to your HR practices. And there are a lot of employment records that employers like to keep, some of which they should keep and some of which they should not. But there are definite methods with which you are supposed to handle that information, and not handling the information properly can lead to a whole host of issues and put a company at risk. Employment records are regulated by the EEOC. They're the ones who kind of dictate what should be retained, how it should be retained, and who should have access to it. And employment records, for purposes of today's conversation, include any and all documentation or information regarding employment activities. And employment activity includes things like recruitment, the actual hiring of an individual, compensation and how you pay people and track that compensation, benefit-related information, performance-related information, medical-related information, including leaves of absence or requests for reasonable accommodation, and pretty much anything and everything that an employer retains about an employee. And as we go into this conversation, we're going to be talking about the proper ways or the best practices for filing employee information so that it mitigates risk for your organization. Before we do that though, I have a polling question. And my first polling question is, do you keep your employee documents in one personnel file? So do you retain everything in one file on an employee?
Here are the results.
Okay, so it looks like a majority of you do not keep them in one file, and there are quite a few of you though that do, and we'll be talking a little bit about that here soon with regards to which is a best practice. I'm going to ask you a second polling question right away. Do you allow supervisors or managers to access all of the information filed on an employee that directly reports to them? So if a supervisor or manager comes up to you and says, hey, I want to see the records on this employee because they report to me, do you allow them to see all of the information that you have on that employee?
All right, here are the results.
Okay, I am very happy to see that the majority of you do not allow supervisors to see all of the information. Because there are some pieces of information that they truly should not have access to. There are best practices when it comes to how to file information and who should have access to that information. So we're going to start off our conversation today by going through those specific items. Best practices for employee files include a process where you actually file information in separate files. So each employee has multiple files, and those files are actually kept in separate drawers or separate areas so that individuals can't improperly access information that they really shouldn't have access to. The three different types of files that the Society of Human Resource Management has identified as the best types of files to maintain on employees are the personnel file, a benefits or medical file, a payroll or confidential file. And there are specific items that go into each one of those files, which we will get into here in a couple of minutes. There are additional files that you should maintain separately. And those include recruitment files. And again, we'll talk about what would be included there, but it's basically all of the information that you're gathering on every single candidate that you considered for a specific position. There are Form I-9 files for current employees, and then Form I-9 files for terminated employees. And you can keep all of your current employee I-9s in one folder or binder. I choose to do it in a binder. And then you would have a separate folder or binder for your terminated employee I-9s. And again, we're going to go through a little bit more detail. But as you can see, there are multiple places where you should be storing employee data, and it should be separate from one another. You should never have one file that includes an employee's personnel information, their benefits and medical information, their payroll and confidential information, their I-9, or their recruitment records. Those files should be handled separately. Now, who should have access to these files? Well, it's pretty straightforward who should have access, and yet it's not communicated very well. So employers oftentimes don't have this information, and sometimes may provide access to employee information to an individual who truly should not have access to that. Best practices are that you restrict your access to these different areas. Supervisors should have access to an employee's personnel file. Human resources, or whoever handles that function for your organization, should have access to all records. The employee can have access to all records, and law enforcement or the EEOC or governmental agencies who have a request for it, they should be provided access to all records. There is a reason why supervisors should not be given access to either the benefit or the medical file or the payroll confidential file, and that's because there's information in those that really is irrelevant to how the employee performs the job, and really the access they should have should be for that information that is relevant to the employee and their performance of the job. So here's the personnel file stuff. This is the big file, and again, this is the one that supervisors actually have access to, as well as human resources, or the person's manager, senior leadership, or governmental agencies. The personnel file includes anything related to their new hire information. So an offer letter, or you may even include a resume in their personnel file. Transcripts or certifications or educational information can go in there. If as a company you have a staff agreement, a confidentiality or non-disclosure agreement, a non-compete agreement, any other type of acknowledgement or agreement would go into their personnel file. In the personnel file, you also maintain the performance documentation. So that could be standard performance evaluations, any performance write-ups if there were issues, performance improvement plans. You can also keep kudos, the things that they do right with regards to their performance, in the personnel file. With regards to compensation information, you'll want to make sure that you have any pay change notifications. So if they're getting a pay increase or a pay decrease, you can keep that information in the file so that when you go to the personnel file, it actually has the person's correct rate of pay. Any changes in their FLSA status, or moving from exempt to non-exempt or non-exempt to exempt status, that would go into the personnel file, as well as any bonus notifications or notifications of any types of additional compensation that the individual might be receiving. In addition to that, you could have job or position specific information. If you're an organization that has detailed job descriptions and you have employees sign their job descriptions to acknowledge that they know exactly what it is that they're supposed to be doing, you can keep that in their personnel file. If you promote somebody, or if you demote someone, or if they have a job change and you've written up some documentation on that, that would also go in this file. Any trainings or certifications that they might receive, whether it's internal training, external training, education through collegiate or high school or different types of vocational schools, all of that can also go in the personnel file. And then last but not least are the acknowledgement forms. If you have an employee handbook, you want to make sure you have an acknowledgement form from each employee indicating that they received the employee handbook, they understand that they have to comply with the policies and expectations in the handbook, and that documentation would go into the acknowledgement form as well. And then policy changes. If you have a change in a policy and you expect employees to initial and date that they received the policy change notification, that would go in this file. Basically, your personnel file contains all of the information that you are going to need in the event that an employee questions something or perhaps goes to a lawyer and tries to file any type of claim against you for wrongful employment practices. This is the file that you go to prove that you explained something, you went through a standard process that's in your handbook, they are aware of what the processes are or what the policy is, and really can be kind of your go-to, we'll call it your CYA file. The personnel file really can help you out in that regard. All right, the second file that I mentioned is the benefits or the medical file. And in this file, you are going to have any type of information or documentation that relates to an employee's benefits that they have selected, their health history, or any medical information. So that would include any benefit enrollment forms, including medical, dental, and vision enrollment or change forms, or waivers if they're waiving coverage, life insurance, flexible spending, HSA or HRA enrollments, retirement enrollments. So it's basically any type of benefit that you provide where the employee has to fill out a form, whether it's to enroll or decline or change or waive the benefit. That information will be filed in your benefits file. When it comes to medical information, what we're referring to here are things such as a reasonable accommodation request. So if an employee has some sort of reasonable accommodation that they need, you will want them to put it in writing so that you can place it into this file. And if you make the accommodation, you'll want to include any of that documentation as well to demonstrate they made the request and here's how you responded. Medical leave requests would also go in the benefits or medical file. So if somebody is going on any type of a medical leave, whether it is some sort of surgery or it is maternity leave or they are injured, any workers' compensation claims, that kind of thing would go into this medical in benefits and medical file. If an employee has doctor's notes that they are submitting to you, whether it's because you requested them or because they themselves are just bringing a note in to say, hey, I was sick, 4 days last week, and here's the note from my doctor to prove it so that they can use their sick leave. You will want to keep those notes in this benefits and medical file. And basically any information or documentation that references the health of the employee or the health of the employee's family member, anything related to medical or health goes into this benefits medical file. And the access to this file is granted to the employee, to HR, and any governmental agency that might request the information. There is no reason for a supervisor, a manager, or senior leadership to access the benefits or medical file because the information in there could be used to make employment decisions that may not be in the favor of the employee. And that cannot take place. That puts the company at great risk. So whoever is handling your human resources function will know what to do if an employee comes to work with a reasonable accommodations request or comes to work with a medical leave. They will handle all the behind the scene confidential components of processing that employment practice, and then can let the supervisor know, hey, Bob is not going to be at work for the next 3 weeks. When he returns, he'll be working a part-time schedule, and sharing information about the specifics for why Bob is going to be gone for 3 weeks and is coming back to work a part-time schedule. It is really not something that the supervisor or the manager should be privy to. It actually can get you into a lot of trouble with regards to discriminatory hiring practice or employment practice claims. So it's really best to separate those two things and grant access to this file only to individuals who need to know how to use the information to determine how that employee will be working moving forward. The third file is the payroll and confidential file. And basically this is the file where stuff goes that it doesn't really fit in either of the other categories, or is information that relates to the employee's payroll, bank account, social security number, those kinds of things. So in the payroll confidential file, you will find information such as the employee's W-4, their direct deposit, any legal documents stating that they just got married or they just got divorced, or child custody paperwork that might affect benefits, death certificates for life insurance purposes for somebody who may have, who may be on their plan, wage garnishments, criminal history or documentation about any convictions that may affect employment. All of that would go into the payroll confidential file. In addition, any requests or verifications for employment that include the employee's personal information, including their social security number, any loan documentation, so if they're taking out a loan on their 401k, or if they are wanting to buy a house or a car, and they're filling out loan paperwork and asking you as the employer to complete the employer section, that would go into this file. If you do background checks as part of your hiring process, or if you do drug tests, or if you do any other kind of testing, all of those results go into the payroll confidential file. And basically any documentation, as I mentioned earlier, that affects employment decisions that don't fit in the personnel file or the benefits medical file. The thing to keep in mind with the payroll confidential file is that if it has an employee's social security number on it, it belongs in this confidential file unless it's a benefit related form. A benefit related form with a social security number on it would go into the benefit medical file, but anything else will go into the payroll confidential file. So if you currently have any new hire paperwork that an employee is required to complete, that they have to put their social security number or birth date or things like that on, it needs to go in the payroll confidential file. And many clients that I have worked with, when I do personnel file audits, a lot of times they will have hard copies of their application. Like it might be way before they had online, an online process for recruitment, but they're still maintaining these records. If it's an application that has this on it, it has to go in the payroll confidential file. It can't stay in their personnel file. You want to make sure that you keep that social security number out. And again, the reason for that is if people get access to the personnel file and it has too much personal information, they could actually take that information and do something with it. And so you need to be able to prove that you have separated these files out, that the benefit and medical file and the payroll and confidential file are both locked away in different cabinets that people just don't even have access to. And that's one way that you would be able to prove that you weren't giving access to information that people shouldn't have. The payroll confidential file, like the medical and benefit file, is one that only the employee, HR, and governmental agencies should have access to. Right, so that brings us to polling question number 3. I am curious to know if any of you have either conducted an audit of your personnel files through an internal process, or if you've been required to submit your files for an audit, either by your auditor or by a governmental agency.
Here are the results.
Okay. Oh, I'm actually surprised. This is great to hear that some of you, I'm hoping it's because you chose to do an audit of your files and not because someone came in and said, hand them over and let me see what's going on here. I think it is always a really good practice to do an HR file audit. There is a lot of information that you can gather from that, which we're going to get into here pretty quickly. If you're unfamiliar with how to do them, I'm going to talk about some best practices. This is something that I do for clients and actually really, really enjoy, because it can provide a lot of insight on an organization and what types of practices they have in play. So how do you do one? For those of you that said you have never done one, you've never been asked to do one, these are kind of the steps that you go through in order to conduct an HR organizational audit. The first thing you want to do is you want to go ahead, and if you don't already have files set up, as we've indicated here are best practices, that's what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to go through every employee and create a personnel file, a benefit medical file, a payroll confidential file, an I-9 binder for your current employees, an I-9 binder for your former employees, and then also recruitment folders for each position that you have recruited for. Okay, so you'll start by doing that. Then what you want to do is to identify what are the required documents that you have every employee fill out or that you create for every employee. Do you have an application? If so, you're going to want to make that one of the items that you're going to check to see if every employee has that. Do you prepare an offer letter? Do you have a staff agreement? Do you have a confidentiality agreement? Do you have a non-compete? Or do you have a different type of document? Maybe it's called your employment agreement and it includes the confidentiality non-compete. What are the standard documents that you have employees complete or provide to employees as part of the onboarding or recruitment process? And then what types of documents do you have that they fill out during orientation? So I-9 better be on your list because everyone needs an I-9. W-4, direct deposit. Is there any other type of payroll related document that you have them fill out? Do you have employees do an emergency contact? Do you have them complete benefit paperwork? Right? So go through all of the documents that you typically will either give to an employee as part of the process of getting them to join your organization, or that you gather from employees as part of the orientation and onboarding process. And then even beyond that, do you have performance evaluations? And what is your performance evaluation process? Do they get an evaluation at 30 days, at 90 days, and then every year on their anniversary? Do you have trainings that you expect employees to go through? Preventing harassment, HIPAA training, safety training. If so, you're gonna, and you have acknowledgements for all of those, you'll want those. Do you make them sign an employee handbook acknowledgement form? You literally will go through every single document and you'll note that. And what I usually do is I create an Excel spreadsheet, and down the left-hand side, I have every employee's name, and across the top, I have every single document that an employee should have as part of their employment records. And then what you do is you then grab your employee's documentation, the information that you have filed on each employee, you go through it and you put a check mark in each of the boxes indicating whether they have that form or not. And at the end, wherever your gaps are, that's the documentation that you need to collect from an employee. Some of it, you're not going to be able to go back. You're never going to go back to a person who's been working for you for 10 years and say, hey, I need for you to fill out the application, right? Because you just didn't fill it out at the time. You're just going to make a note that says, did not have an application, have updated our process so that all individuals moving forward will complete an application and it will be added to their records. All right, but there are other documents that you really want to make sure employees do fill out. For example, if you find that somebody doesn't have a confidentiality agreement signed, or they don't have an employee handbook acknowledgement form signed, or they don't have their preventing harassment policy or training form signed, those are things that you will want to follow up on, because an employee without a confidentiality agreement can actually go out there and spill confidential information. And if there's nothing that they have signed that says that they won't do it, even if you terminate them, they have a leg to stand on to come back and file a suit for wrongful discharge or wrongful employment practices, right? So you want to make sure that those core documents that you have for employees, that every employee has them taken care of. Now, what do you do in the event that someone decides they're not going to sign a document, all right? Well, you have a couple options. First thing you can do is to meet with them and say, hey, we did this HR organizational audit because we're trying to make sure that our records are up to date and that we have consistent practices moving forward. And I realize you didn't sign one when you first started, or you didn't sign this form when we recently asked you to, but I need for you to sign it because that we're just trying to get our practices up to date. If they still refuse to sign it, if it's something that's not a big deal to you, then you can make a note that they refuse to sign it, or you can ask them to put on the document, I'm refusing to sign, okay? But you wanna make sure that you at least have some sort of acknowledgement that you went to the employee and tried to get them to sign the missing documentation. The third option, if it's something that could put the firm or the company at risk, you can make it a condition of their continued employment to get the paperwork signed. For example, if they're not willing to sign the confidentiality agreement, or they're not willing to sign the employee handbook acknowledgement form, and you want to make sure that your organization is not in a position of risk for having them go do something that could hurt the company, you can tell them, I need for you to sign this document. It is a condition of your continued employment. And if they don't sign it, you can terminate them for not complying with that. Now, could they come back with a wrongful termination suit? They sure could, but chances are highly likely if you are in an at-will state, while you'd have to go through the efforts of fighting the claim, you would come out victorious in a majority of those cases. Because you can prove that it's a condition of employment for people to sign the employee handbook form, for them to complete their I-9. That's a big one. If somebody's not willing to provide you with work authorization documents, it's illegal for you to employ them. So you can make things a condition of employment. It has been in extremely rare cases where I have seen that has ever come to play. Normally, if you sit down with an employee and just explain, look, this is a standard confidentiality agreement. It was supposed to have been provided to you at the time that you started, or maybe you signed it, we just don't have a copy of it. And so we'd like to get our records up to date. Most employees are pretty understanding of that. Polling question number 4. Do you retain the documentation that you gathered during your recruitment and hiring process?
And here are the results.
Okay. Okay, great. It's good to hear that you do retain that documentation. And I wish that there was a better way for me to gather this information rather than through a polling question. But if I could gather the information, my follow-up question would be, what exactly is it that you are retaining? And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but I will make just a few comments. There is specific information that you actually should retain. And there's some of the information that there might be double copies. You might have it in your recruitment information just for your tracking purposes, as well as in somebody's personnel file if you actually hired them. And I have starred those on this presentation. When it comes to recruitment information, you should separate your files by position. And if you hire multiples of a specific type of a position, it's okay to keep them for whatever time frame. Like, let's say you hired, you had 10 production operator positions available. You could have one production operator file. Now, if you have 4 departments that are hiring production operators, you might want to separate it into departments because you're going to have different hiring managers who might make different decisions. One department might hire somebody that another department doesn't. So I truly recommend that you separate them to the best of your ability based on position. Within your file, you are going to keep the interview or even just the job application records for any individual who applied for that position. And you're going to organize them by the individual or individuals that you hired the individuals that you may have extended an offer to, but they maybe declined your offer, or you just never heard back from them, so they didn't get hired. The individuals that you interviewed, but were not selected to be hired. Candidates that you may have phone screened or done some other type of a screening with that were not selected for an interview. Individuals who applied who were not qualified. Those who applied and withdrew from consideration. Maybe you reached out to them and they decided, yeah, I'm not interested anymore, I found another job. You'll want to maintain those. And then if you do any kind of background testing, drug testing, assessment or skill testing, and they didn't get hired because of that, those will be filed separately. And the reason you want to do that is because if you have a similar position come up again, or if you, if the person that you hired, heaven forbid, decides that they're not going to join you after all, you can then go back to these individuals and you've already got it sorted. The folks that you extended an offer to but maybe didn't get hired, you can follow up with them again. Or people that you may have declined, the individuals that you declined, that maybe they were second on your list, you went with this number one choice, this is your second choice, and now you want to hire them, you opened up another position, you have everything organized so that you can quickly go back there and actually take a look at the candidates that you already had in process for the same position, right? So it really can help, instead of starting from ground zero every single time that you are trying to fill the same type of a position. You have this pool of candidates that you've already met with, already talked with, that you can go back to, which is a blessing for those of you who are involved in recruitment. The information that you're going to want to retain on any candidate for your position would be their resume, their application, any educational transcripts or certifications. And again, if you hire the person, you might want to make a copy of those to put into their personnel file. If you do a phone screen or an interview and you took notes, those notes you're going to want to keep together with the candidate's information. Any interview feedback forms or notes. So if you have a formal process where you have 5 people involved in interviewing candidates, they all fill out a form, all of those forms need to be kept with that candidate's information and should be filed in the recruitment folder for the position. Any background check or testing results, any offer details, like if you're making notes on what you want to extend the offer for, or if you actually do extend the offer, you can make a copy of the offer letter so that you know the next time you hire somebody, hey, this is what we offered this person. It just makes it easy to come up with what your offer details should be. And then any voluntary EEO information. Now the voluntary EEO information, you kind of have to separate out and keep that in a separate area, but you do want to maintain records of any voluntary EEO information you have for a position. That's going to help you prove that you're not discriminating against individuals when it comes to your recruitment process. You can prove that, well, we hired a Caucasian male for this position because according to our EEO sheets, only Caucasian males applied. So we were not discriminating against anyone based on their gender or their race or ethnicity. EEO information and testing results, that should only be accessed by human resources. And I cannot emphasize enough that if you have someone in HR who is kind of coordinating all of your recruitment processes, or there's some designated person that handles this for you, when you are doing testing, they should be the only person who see the results. They need to have some guidelines with regards to when they can say this person failed the background check, this person failed the drug test, this person failed whatever assessment it is. And all they should communicate to the hiring team is that it's great, they passed their assessments, their background check, their drug test, or I'm sorry, we cannot hire them because they did not pass it, okay? Specific details with regards to why someone failed the background check should not be shared with the hiring manager or the hiring team. That is confidential information that really should be given to one specific person in your organization to handle. And maybe you decide that that's going to be the CEO, because the CEO is the one who wants to make the decision as to whether somebody's passing a background check, passing a drug test, passing a skill assessment. But it should not be shared with everybody who interviewed or even the hiring manager. It can get you into trouble. And I've seen clients in situations where someone has shared with the hiring manager, hey, they failed their background check because they were convicted of a felony. And then that hiring manager, just in a random conversation, happens to talk with somebody else who was on the hiring team, somebody at the manager level, and shares that information. Well, now that very confidential information has gone where it didn't need to go, right? So I really do recommend that as a best practice, you identify somebody within your organization who can make those types of decisions as to what passing the test, the check, the whatever is, and just give them the power to say, yes, they passed it, or no, they didn't, and not feel compelled or pressured to share the information as to why someone hasn't passed. That can get you into a lot of trouble. General recruitment information, of course, can be viewed by the hiring manager or those up the chain of command. So if somebody wants to see the resume, the application, the interview notes, or the phone screen notes, if they're on the hiring team, that's appropriate. And I actually recommend that if you are bringing people in for an interview, that you not only share the resume and the application, but that you also share any interview notes that you may have had. If you did a phone interview where you were asking basic questions about their skill set, why they're wanting to make a job change, the only thing I wouldn't share would be compensation related information, but the other stuff can really help the interviewers determine what kinds of questions do they want to ask during the interview, right? If I see in the phone interview notes that they're saying they want to make a change because they'd like to advance in their career, I might want to ask, well, how far up the chain of command do you want to go, and how quickly do you want to get there, right? Because maybe my organization only has 15 people, so there's not going to be a whole lot of upward mobility. The growth is going to come through skill set enhancement, working on different types of projects, being able to make some changes, those kinds of things. But it's not necessarily that you're going to go from an entry-level position to a director position. You're not going to get a director title unless the current director decides to leave the organization. So sharing that information as part of the interview process is absolutely appropriate, but they should not have access to EEO information or any type of background test, drug test, those kinds of things. All right, polling question number 5. We are going to spend pretty much the rest of our time today talking about the I-9, because this is the area that gets most employers into the biggest amount of trouble. So, polling question: do you have one person or department that handles the completion of the Form I-9 for your employees as part of their orientation?
Here are the results.
Okay, I am really, really pleased to see that the majority of you do have one person or at least one department that handles the completion of the Form I-9. The penalties for completing an I-9 incorrectly can be anything from $400 per form on up to thousands of dollars per form, depending upon what the error is. I have done a lot of I-9 audits for clients. I have yet to have a client who has 100% of their I-9s completed correctly. The majority of them have about 90% of their I-9 forms completed incorrectly. And most of the changes are easy changes to make. They require minimal effort, but there are some that require a little bit more effort. And it is an employer's responsibility to make sure that I-9 forms are completed correctly. So we're going to spend some time on that today, just because I really do, I see it a lot with clients, and I want to make sure everyone that's taking part in this webcast has an understanding of what their responsibility actually is. So I-9 forms, that's an additional filing requirement. All right, so you have to file your I-9s by keeping your current employee I-9s in one area or one record, and your former employee I-9s in a different record. They cannot be filed together. I really recommend using a binder. Binders are so much easier, and have them alphabetized. That way you can just flip through the pages instead of having a filing system. It makes it a lot easier. What you are retaining would be page 1 and page 2 of the Form I-9. And if you are choosing to keep copies of the employee's work authorization documents, then you're keeping those with page 1 and page 2 for each employee. All right. The pro to maintaining copies of an employee's work authorization is that if there is ever a question about their authorization, you have that documentation that can support what was completed on the I-9. If you do not retain the work authorization documentation, so copies of whatever it is that they brought to prove that they are legally authorized to work in the US, whether that's a passport, a driver's license or military ID card, and a birth certificate or social security card or a green card or a work visa. If you maintain those copies for one employee, you have to maintain them for all. All right. And if you choose not to retain them, that's fine. The government does not require you to do it. But if there is a question about someone's work authorization, you are going to then have to have them get that information, bring it to you so that you can verify it against what you have in the documentation, the form that they completed. So in my mind, it is less risky to make copies, but you have to make sure that you're retaining them properly. All right. For former employee I-9s, you are keeping the same stuff. So page 1 and page 2 of Form I-9, copies of their work authorization documentation, if that's part of your process, and you have to retain former employee I-9s for a period of 1 year from their termination date, or 3 years from the termed employee's start date. So if they started on January 1st of 2019 and they left in June of 2020, you still have to maintain that record until January 1st of 2022, because that will be 3 years, right? If it's a long-term employee who has been with you for longer than 3 years, then you only retain it for 1 year from when they termed. You got to play the math in your head. I'm an HR girl, not a math girl, so I usually just go to the calendar and check it to make sure. The I-9 form should not be viewed by anyone other than human resources or the person who's responsible for maintaining the I-9 forms for you, or governmental agencies that might come. And when ICE comes knocking and wants to see your forms, you have to comply and provide them. And I recommend that you have them organized in a way that you can get them what they need and get them out. It just makes it so much easier for you. So with the Form I-9, I always find it really interesting. It is a 2-page document that has a government manual that is 89 pages long to explain to you how to complete the 2-page document. So it does not surprise me at all that people struggle with the I-9 form. So with the I-9 form, you must notify new hires of the requirement to complete the Form I-9. Most of us know that we're going to have to complete it on our first day of employment. But if you hire somebody and you have their start date set up for 2 weeks from now, it does not hurt to tell them, hey, on your first day of employment, we're going to need for you to submit your work authorization. Let them know as much in advance as you can, so that if they can't find their documentation, or if they find their passport and it's expired, they have plenty of time to go get proper work authorization documentation. All right, so page 3 of the Form I-9 is actually the list of acceptable documents. And with the list of acceptable documents, employees can, they can bring one item from list A, or they will bring one item from list B and an item from list C, right? So if they have a passport or a work authorization card or something that's from list A, they only need that one document. And it is super important not to make someone over document, because that can get you into just as much trouble as if they didn't bring in the right documentation to begin with. All right, so best practices for the Form I-9 is to notify new hires of the requirement and to share page 3 with them so they know what types of documentation they need to bring in. I was glad to see that a majority of you said you have one person or one specific department that completes it, because that is also best practice. You should designate a specific person to complete the Form I-9 process for your organization. The more people you have doing this, the more errors you are going to have. It's inevitable. Whenever I do these audits, I have some clients that have multiple locations and they have somebody in their specific offices that do it. And whenever that happens, inevitably there is one person who completes every single one of them wrong in the exact same way. And by having one person do it, you can train them properly and you can feel confident that they will complete these for your organization correctly. So the person who you designate to complete the Form I-9 on behalf of the organization will review page 1 to ensure the employee completed all of the sections on page 1. There are boxes such as middle initial or other names used or apartment number that aren't relevant to everybody. And so a lot of times employees will leave those blank. And believe it or not, that'll get you into trouble. So you need to make sure that whoever is reviewing these tells the individual, the new hire who's completing it, you have to fill in every single box. So if you don't have a middle initial, if you haven't ever gone by any other names, if you don't have an apartment number, put NA in that box, okay? There are other sections that need to be completed. This person just needs to go through and make sure that the new hire has completed every single section, all right? Then this designated employee is going to review the documentation that the employee has brought to verify their work authorization, and they are going to complete the section on page 2. They will then complete the employer section on page 2, and they will make copies of the employee's work authorization documents and attach it to the Form I-9. So that is what the employer's responsibility is. You have to do it correctly, and the main reason for that is because the Department of Homeland Security, Immigrations, Custom, and Enforcement has increased Form I-9 audits by 60% since 2018, right? This is designed for industries that perhaps have hired individuals who don't have the legal right to work in the United States, and unfortunately, it impacts every single company, every single employer now, because they are cracking down by doing audits of just random companies. All right, so section 3, re-verifications and rehires. So if an employee is rehired within 3 years from the date their Form I-9 was previously completed, you just have them look over their form. If everything is the same, they're going to sign and date the form. That's all they have to do. If their work authorization from the previous form has expired, you want to re-verify their employment authorization, provide the rehire date, and sign and date the form. And this is a section that is on page 2 down at the bottom. Okay, if the Form I-9 is not the current version, and you always want to go out and make sure that you have the current version, you have to complete section 3 on the current version of the form and attach it to the original. Employees that are rehired after 3 years of the original completion of their Form I-9 have to complete a brand new one. So they'll have to bring in new documentation as well. All right, so employees have to be allowed to choose which documents they will present from the list of acceptable documents. So remember when I told you after you hire somebody, you want to forward them page 3 of the Form I-9? You cannot put in writing, hey, we need for you to bring work authorization documents like a passport or your driver's license and social security number. You cannot make any recommendations whatsoever. What you need to do is just say, we need for you to bring work authorization. Please take a look at the attached document and bring the appropriate items. You will bring one item from list A, or an item from list B, and an item from list C. Do not over-verify. If somebody brings in a passport, a military ID card, and a birth certificate, I would just pick which one you want to use, right? You'll either use the passport, or you're going to use the military ID and the birth certificate. Do not record all three of them on the form and make copies of all three. That is considered to be over documentation, and it can be said that you are discriminating against individuals, and they will figure out a way to say how you're discriminating. You're discriminating against this individual because he's in the military, because you took not only the military ID and his birth certificate, but you also required him to provide the passport. So do not over verify. It's really, really important. Oh. All right. Now, when you are doing an HR organizational audit, it should always include Form I-9s, because as I mentioned, the majority of I-9s that have been completed are completed incorrectly. Some of the corrections, super duper easy to make, others a little more difficult. So we're gonna kind of just go through these. So making corrections, when you go through your I-9s and you identify what corrections need to be made, and you make those corrections, you are telling ICE and the Department of Homeland Security that you're making a good faith effort to ensure that you are hiring individuals who are legally authorized to work in the US, and that you are making corrections in the event that you find out someone does not have work authorization. Making that good faith effort can save you if you are audited. So if somebody comes in and audits you and they see that you've done your own internal audit, you've made corrections, they may say, hey, you know what? You're doing a great job. We looked through your records. Everything looks good. If they come in and they find errors, they're going to fine you. If you can't show that you're making a good faith effort to only hire individuals who have work authorization, they will fine you. So any corrections that you make on the form, it's super easy to do, whether the employee does it or your designated I-9 form specialist does it. You draw through the incorrect information, you enter the correct information, and then you initial and date your correction. I often take it a step further by creating a document that shows all the different corrections that can be made, checking them off, and then at the bottom indicating we conducted an audit of Form I-9s for our organization on XYZ date and have made the appropriate corrections. And then I attach it to any I-9 that I do correct. And that way, again, if you get audited, they know that, oh, they did their own internal audit and they've made their corrections, so they're making that good faith effort. Section 1 corrections can only be made by the employee. So remember when I said that oftentimes an employee will not enter a middle initial, other names used, or an apartment number because they don't have any of those things? The employee has to make those corrections. So when you have an employee make the correction, they would come in, they would put NA if they're not applicable, and then they would initial and date it. Or sometimes they actually did have a middle initial, they just didn't want to put it down. So you'll have them put it, their middle initial, and they'll initial and date it. They can make those changes, all right? Section 2 and Section 3 corrections have to be made by the employer. And for an employer to make a correction, again, all they do is just line through the error, write the correct information, initial, and date it. And as I mentioned previously, a note regarding the corrections that you've made and the fact that you did it because you did an internal audit can be attached to the Form I-9. If there are so many mistakes that the I-9 now looks a hot mess, you can complete a new I-9 form and attach it to the old form so that it's easy to identify. Okay, I'm actually going to go back because I wanted to make a couple of comments since we have just a minute or so. On page 1 of the Form I-9, there's section 1 where they enter their employee information. There's section 2 where they indicate what their work authorization status is. So they're either a legal resident of the United States, they're they were born in the United States, they have a visa or work permit, they have to check what their work authorization actually is. And then down at the bottom, a lot of times people will miss this section. It's on the translator or preparer section. An employee has to indicate whether they had someone assist them with completing the I-9 form, or if they had a translator who translated it. They either check yes, they did have someone help them, and then they write the information in, or the person who is doing it writes the information in, or they check no, because they didn't have somebody help them. That is one thing that I see missed a lot. And on page 2, which is the employer's required section, there is a top line where you're supposed to put the employee's last name, first name, middle initial, and what their work authorization status is as indicated on page 1. That section gets missed probably 99 times out of 100. So just make sure that you look at those sections. And those are all easy fixes. All right, so in the end, when you do an audit of your personnel files or your HR organizational files, it can help you identify gaps or inconsistencies with your HR processes. Like, you may note that not everybody is filling out all these forms. That might mean that there's something missing from your onboarding or your orientation process. You may notice that these people have performance evaluations, but the folks in this department don't. And so you know that there might be a gap in your performance management process. So just, you can keep an eye on those types of things to see where your gaps in your HR processes are. This also allows you to correct any inconsistent practices that could put your organization at risk. And some of them could be employment law related risks. So doing your organizational audit can really kind of pinpoint what things you need to improve in your HR practices. And once you have those consistent practices identified and can fix the ones that are inconsistent, what that's going to do is it's going to allow your business leaders to focus on business operations and not have to worry about the personnel files and the records that you're keeping on individuals. And if you have consistent, strong practices in place, that's really going to be attractive for individuals who want to join your organization, and it's going to be super attractive to the folks that you already have. So it will improve your recruitment and your retention. That is all I have today. So if there are any questions, I realize we are at 1 o'clock. I'm happy to stay on and answer questions if you have them. Otherwise, I really appreciate your time today, and feel free to reach out if you need me for anything. And thank you so much for your time today.